On December 6, 1941, Americans were living their lives as usual for the most part. To be sure, the war in Europe had brought new tensions. Over a year earlier, President Roosevelt had declared a state of national emergency. Many young men had been called by the draft, and others had enlisted in the service. In the eastern half of the country, in particular, most people knew someone who had gone to Canada to enlist and get in the fight, or someone who was talking about doing so. But on the whole, the concerns of Americans on this day were those of a nation that hoped not to be involved in war. In Manila, President Manuel Con of the Philippine Commonwealth Government indicated his hope that persons who did not have to remain in that capital city would not. This statement was widely interpreted by the press to mean a call to American civilians to leave the islands. Indeed, many had done so already as tensions grew between the Western powers and Japan, but a ship was supposed to be leaving in 2 days for San Francisco, and hundreds were trying to get aboard her. Singapore that day was put on a war footing, and all servicemen were called to their duty stations. In Honolulu, columnist James H. Chun of the Star Bulletin wrote that the United States and Japan were just then closer to war than at any time since Commodore Matthew C. Perry had opened the Japanese islands to foreign trade nearly 100 years before. If only the negotiations in progress in Washington could stave off disaster, said Mr. Chun, the tension would certainly ease. But most people in Honolulu were more concerned with the expected shortage of Christmas trees for the season and with the social activities looming in the holidays. The Navy contingent had a round of parties coming up. The Honolulu Community Theatre had just closed a presentation of Mr. and Mrs. North, which had been hailed as an enormous success. Rear Admiral Raymond Bruin and his family were busy settling in at their new house at 4586 Ori Street in the fashionable Kahala district. To be sure, the Pacific had been alive with rumours for weeks, and a fleet of B-17 bombers had been dispatched from California to shore up the air defences of Hawaii and the Pacific Fleet. A message had also come from a British agent in Manila that the Japanese were massing in Indochina and were ready to move in force in the Pacific. But in Los Angeles, the big news that Saturday was that the arch-rivals of the South, the University of California at Los Angeles and the University of Southern California, had fought all afternoon beneath the sun in the Rose Bowl and emerged with a 7-7 tie. In San Francisco, the big news was that Maxim Litvinov, the new Soviet ambassador to the United States, had just arrived by air from Siberia. The Russians, who had been regarded with deep suspicion since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1918, were considered to be heroic fighters for freedom since Hitler had invaded the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics 6 months earlier. In Washington, much of the talk was about America's defense posture. One retired admiral, speaking candidly, said the United States was already involved in war in Europe, which was true. American ships were even then fighting German U-boats, but most Americans did not know this, and President Roosevelt was careful that they did not know how heavily he had committed the nation to a war that most Americans wanted to avoid. Navy Secretary Knox released his annual report on December 6th, announcing proudly that the United States Navy had never been stronger, with 325 new ships and 259 new aircraft delivered. Off in Kansas City, Senator Harry S. Truman was talking about government waste, not war. In Pittsburgh, newspaper readers were enwrapped in the story of the Mantle Club, supposedly a social club of national scope, which had turned out to be a first-class swindle designed to mulct the public of millions of dollars for uniforms and other club regalia. 19 indictments were handed down on December 5th in Pittsburgh. From the Midwest came reports of new ways of raising money for defense bonds, bond parties, at which everyone subscribed before they started dancing. In upstate New York, much of the talk was about strikes, and the Chevrolet plant in Buffalo was about to be struck, and labor difficulties seemed to be bothering most heavy industry. Down in Georgia, when writer Varine Bell picked up the newspaper, the big story was from Atlanta, where the Southeast Pipeline Company had just completed a new line running from Chattanooga to Port St. Joe, Florida, that was expected to solve the shortage of natural gas. Down in Jacksonville, Louise Shared was much more interested in a news story from Miami Beach. Pictures of Sergeant William Buckley of the Army Air Corps and his wife, Lila Jean, were all over the newspapers. Sergeant Buckley and Jean were something like hero and heroine symbols of the times. The sergeant had wanted desperately to become a pilot, but Air Corps regulations stipulated that only single men were taken for flight duty. Seeing the sergeant's distress, Lila Jean had divorced him. He had gone to flight school, passed his tests, become an airman, and then was allowed to get married. Then he and Lila Jean had got married again. This subject was of more than a little interest to Louise Shared, for it had not been so very long before that she had broken with her own aviator. There were echoes of warlike behaviour about. In New York, a crowd downtown watched in horror that day as an Army Air Corps fighter exploded over the city. But even bigger news to many was the inauguration of a Pan American Airways Clipper service to Africa. The Gallup poll was not concerned that day with how Americans felt about Germany, Japan, or the possibility of war. The burning issue was the American attitude toward vitamins, and the New York Times turned its attention in its lead editorial to the pressing problems of the 100 Neediest Persons Fund. As the day ended and Americans retired to their beds, they looked forward to a quiet pre-Christmas Sunday in which they would digest the Sunday newspapers, read the ads for next week's Christmas shopping, and then turn on the radio toward evening to hear Eddie Cantor and Charlie McCarthy and Jack Benny. America was at peace, even if it was an uneasy peace. Then, as the sun moved across the sky from the east, came the morning of December 7th. At 7 o'clock, the cities and towns of the eastern seaboard began to come awake. When it was 7 o'clock in southern Illinois, it was 8 o'clock in Jacksonville, and all was well. When it was 7 o'clock in San Francisco, it was 10 o'clock in Jacksonville, and all was well. When it was 7 o'clock in Honolulu, it was noon in Jacksonville, and suddenly all was not well at all. Lieutenant Commander Richard Ballinger, the 36-year-old duty officer of the Hawaiian Patrol Wing at Pearl Harbor, was taking his morning shower in the bachelor officers' quarters when his assistant came bursting in to announce that one of the wing's seaplanes was attacking an unknown submarine at the entrance to Pearl Harbor. It was no drill. The message had come in the war code, which was not to be used for exercises. Ballinger hastened from the shower and glanced at his wristwatch. It was 7 o'clock. The Hawaiian Patrol Wing had been expecting something of this sort for weeks, as rumours flew around Pearl Harbor that the Japanese were up to no good. Ballinger dressed and hurried to a telephone to call the staff operations officer who lived in Honolulu. The operations officer was up and alert. He had just taken a call from the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet Headquarters duty officer, who told him that a destroyer also reported attacking a submarine at the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Were there 2 submarines? Lieutenant Commander Ballinger was ordered to send out the standby patrol squadron, which consisted of 6 seaplanes. He made the necessary call and then went to the operations office of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet for further orders. As he waited inside the building, he heard the engine sounds of many aircraft. The big fleet carrier USS Enterprise was at sea with Task Force 8 under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, and hurried to a telephone to call the staff operations officer who lived in Honolulu. The operations officer was up and alert. He had just taken a call from the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet Headquarters duty officer, who told him that a destroyer also reported attacking a submarine at the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Were there 2 submarines? Lieutenant Commander Ballinger was ordered to send out the standby patrol squadron, which consisted of 6 seaplanes. He made the necessary call and then went to the operations office of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet for further orders. As he waited inside the building, he heard the engine sounds of many aircraft. The big fleet carrier, USS Enterprise, was at sea with Task Force 8 under Vice Admiral William F. Halsey. Bombs were dropping fast. Ballinger looked over at Battleship Row and saw battleships listing and the Arizona sinking. Until this point, he had not been conscious of the character of the airplanes above, but now he saw the rising sun fireballs on the wings of a diving plane and realized that they were Japanese and that the war indeed had begun. Ballinger waited no longer at ops but headed for the wing's hangars and took charge. Then he took a detail of medics to the living quarters in the compound to check on the families of his men. In a few minutes, it was all over. The battleships of Battleship Row, symbols of the might of the Pacific Fleet, lay scattered and askew. The Arizona had sunk at her mooring, carrying down hundreds of young Americans to a watery death. Hundreds of others had been killed or wounded aboard other ships and on the ground by the surprise Japanese attack. As the bombs and torpedoes began to explode and the American military moved into tardy action, the radio waves began to hum across the Pacific. "Pearl Harbor has been bombed by the Japanese," said the message. In minutes, radio stations all across America were interrupting broadcasts to bring the dreadful, sobering news to the nation, millions of whom still believed the United States could somehow manage to remain aloof from the war that was ravaging the world. Not all, of course, not all. One of those who knew certainly that war was coming was Captain Hugh H. Goodwin, a Naval Academy graduate with years of service in China and the Philippines during the 1920s. He knew the Japanese. He had studied war plans against them at the Naval War College, and he was not surprised when the news came to Washington that December day. Captain Goodwin was just then preparing to go to Argentina, as the Argentine government had asked the United States to help establish a naval war college for the training of cadets. Goodwin was one of 2 senior officers who had already been assigned to the job. He tried that December to get out of it and to get on a ship, but there was no hope. He had his job, and he had to do it the best he could. The best he could achieve was a promise from friends in Washington that after a year they would help him get his ship and get into the Pacific. For now, it was away to Buenos Aires, about as far from the war as one could get. When the news of the Japanese attack struck Thomasville, Georgia, one young man who heard was Vine Bell, the son of Georgia Supreme Court Justice R.C. Bell. He was just then basking in the success of his first novel, Swamp Water, which had been made into a motion picture with the premiere performance held in Thomasville. He was writing for Outdoor Life magazine and working on his second novel, which Collier's magazine had already agreed to serialize. Already he was rich beyond his earliest dreams, and the future was bright. He was a national celebrity. Life magazine sent an expedition into the Okefenokee Swamp, and Bell had been their guide. He was even an international celebrity. In London, the Times literary supplement praised Swamp Water as the leading American novel of the year. War was the furthest thing from Vine Bell's mind that December day until the broadcasts came. That day, after Sunday dinner, a 16-year-old high school boy named Tony Piniak left the family house in Binghamton, New York, and went over to see Joseph Weiss, his pal. They disappeared into Weiss's basement, where Joseph had a dark room, and spent the afternoon developing and printing pictures. Piniak did not learn about the Japanese attack until they came up from the basement that evening. The next day at school, all the kids were talking about it, and when a lot of them began to say they were going to enlist, Tony Piniak got the war bug. But it did him no good. He would not be 17 until June 1942, and his father would not sign the papers to let him enlist even then. Ranny L. Odom, a boy from southern Illinois, was about as discouraged as one man could get on the morning of December 7th, 1941. He had been trying to get into the Navy for years. His dream was triggered by the 1933 movie Helldivers, in which Clark Gable played an intrepid naval carrier pilot who was engaged in stirring adventures and got the girl, Jean Harlow, in the end. From the beginning, however, Ranny's efforts to follow Clark Gable had been dogged by misfortune. His older brother Pete had secured an appointment to the Naval Academy, and his letters from Annapolis were the delight of the younger brother. But Pete washed out after his plebe year, and Ranny didn't even get that far. His first rigorous physical examination revealed the fact that his feet were as flat as a steam iron. Odom's subsequent experiences are a revelation as to the state of American preparedness for the war. After enrolling in the University of Illinois, he had studied civil engineering and also earned his pilot's license in the civilian pilot training program at Urbana. Later, he was persuaded by a naval aviation recruiting team to apply for training under a new program to become a naval aerological officer. When he arrived in New York, however, he and 50 other young men were told the program had been cancelled for lack of funds. They could go home or stay on without pay. The United States Weather Bureau had been asked to take them as temporary employees, but this had to be fought through the bureaucracy and would take time. What to do? The decision was not too difficult for Rani Odom and some of the others. They had spent their last cash and did not have the fare home, so they stayed. The civilians lent them money for meals, and they stayed without registering or paying in a university dormitory. Early in December, Odom and 5 others in the program pooled their cash, $26, and bought a 1926 Chevrolet sedan. They were on a tour of New England when they pulled into a Vermont Crossroads store around noon on December 7th. They were eating lunch there when the news was announced on the radio that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. The middle-aged lady behind the counter looked sadly at the 6 young men. "Boys," she said, "our country is caught up in another terrible foreign war. Thousands of young men will be hurt and killed." They all sat silent, listening to the radio. Then one of Odom's friends piped up, "Where is Pearl Harbor?" Rani Odom completed the aerological course a month after the Pearl Harbor attack and went home to Illinois to wait for orders. Finally, they came, take another Navy physical examination. He was flunked by 2 Navy doctors, but when he told his story to their boss, a commander, that doctor who knew the ropes wrote on the examination form, "Feet, 1st degree flat, not disqualifying." It was an enormous lie by naval standards, but at the moment entirely satisfactory to all concerned. Ensign R.L. Odom, United States Naval Reserve Aviation Volunteer, Special Number 1131,255, was in the Navy and was ordered to the United States Naval Air Station at Miami. When the devastating attack struck Pearl Harbor, Aviation Cadet William Roger McClendon was at Corpus Christi Naval Air Station struggling with the intricacies of aerial navigation, elementary meteorology, aeronautical science, and the art of keeping an airplane off the ground, except when one wanted to get there. He had left his studies at North Texas State University during his senior year to enter pilot training. On Saturday afternoon, Cadet McClendon had been downtown in Corpus Christi, ordering a new suit at one of the men's clothing stores. Then came Sunday and the news of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. On Monday, Cadet McClendon cancelled the order for his new suit. He wouldn't be needing it right away. In Jacksonville, Florida, Louise Shared heard the news of the bombing when she idly switched on the radio. She was at home and bored because a few months earlier she had broken off a romance with Enon Henry Burt Bassett, United States Naval Reserve. Restlessly, she moved around the house, trying to get her thoughts together, and she waited for more information about the bombings. But there was no information. The cloak of secrecy had been brought down to mask the terrible extent of the damage which had immobilized the American battleship fleet. Louise Shared decided to go to the movies to take her mind off the terrible news. Halfway through the show, the picture was interrupted by an announcement. "All servicemen report at once to your stations." When fully half the audience stood up, Louise Shared suddenly realized that the bombing of Pearl Harbor had put an end to a period of her life. She thought of Enon Henry Burt Bassett, to whom she had not written once since their quarrel. "How could a girl sacrifice her pride?" she had said. But on Pearl Harbor Day, pride no longer mattered. She went home and wrote Burt a postcard which said, "I still love you," and by return mail he wrote asking her to marry him. On the afternoon of December 7th, 1941, aviation machinists mate First Class Walter Flanders and his wife May decided to go to the Gator Bowl at Jacksonville to watch a football game. Flanders was an Airedale, a trained flight deck plane handler who had learned his specialty aboard the old carrier Saratoga. He was stationed at the naval station at Jacksonville, and the air station football team that day was playing the Norfolk Naval Air Station team. Midway in the game, the announcer on the public address system broke into the play to report the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Flanders sat stunned for a moment. Then the vision of Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor came into his mind. He turned to his wife May. "I think we'd better get home. The base will be calling." She nodded. They left then and went home to await the word. The war had come to aviation machinist's mate first-class Flanders. In Manila, Admiral Tommy Hart had the word about the bombing within minutes after the occurrence. He knew then that his position was hopeless. The largest ship attached to the Asiatic fleet was a cruiser. The single carrier, USS Langley, was virtually useless as a fighting ship, outmoded and slow, and more useful as a plain ferry than anything else. Hart and General MacArthur both knew that the United States Navy had nothing in Far Eastern waters capable of stopping the Japanese. As for slowing them, even the single hope was the submarine force, and the submarines were mostly the old S-class, again outmoded and short of range. The Asiatic fleet, like all the American defences, was crippled from the outset by all those years of congressional neglect. No one even knew at this point the most disastrous failure of all. Because Congress would not countenance waste, the American naval forces were not allowed to fire live torpedoes in practice. Thus, no one knew that the American torpedoes were next to useless, for they ran erratically, and their warheads often failed to explode because of a faulty firing mechanism. In the Philippine campaign to come, American submarine commanders would fire and fire again at certain targets, and nothing would happen. At least this ignorance was concealed from the American fighters in the beginning. What they did not know would not hurt them, but it would also teach some valuable lessons for the future. Admiral Hart decided, under the circumstances, with the Japanese beginning to land on Luzon Island and large naval forces offshore, to dispatch the major elements of his fleet to the south to fight again where it might count. Seaman Hugh Bell was sound asleep in his bunk aboard the oiler USS Trinity in Manila Bay when the alarm sounded at 4:30 a.m. on December 7th. Japan had declared war on the United States, and he was told, "Man your battle station." All that night in the blackness, Bell stood at his station at the 5-inch gun, and nothing happened. The first air raid alarm sounded at 12:20 p.m., and all hands manned their guns, watching the planes that circled above them. Then came the all clear. They were United States Army planes. Nothing more of excitement happened. At 4 p.m., the Trinity got under way. She was sent to sea with the old carrier Langley, and a force that included the oiler Pecos and 2 destroyers. At 6 p.m., the ship was blacked out, and they travelled all night through the darkness. At dawn they were alert again. The call to general quarters came at 8:45 a.m. Someone thought he had sighted a submarine. It was a false alarm. That day the cruisers Houston and Boise joined up. Bell did not know it, but he was part of Task Force 5, commanded by Admiral William A. Glassford, and on Admiral Hart's orders, the force was heading for Balikpapan in the Dutch East Indies, which the Allies planned to use as a base for a last-ditch stand against the Japanese naval units moving south. The days went by. The Houston scout planes droned lazily over the task force watching. On December 10th, at 2:30 p.m., the Langley opened up on the water with every gun she could bring to bear. Someone thought he had seen a submarine again, and nothing appeared. All was serene, and they steamed southward until 11:20 a.m. on December 12th, when the klaxons and the speaker announced an air raid. The Langley off Trinity's beam began to fire. Trinity began firing her guns, and they fired for a full minute before the captain ordered, "Cease fire, boys! You've been shooting at the planet Venus." But there were aircraft about. At 2 p.m., a PBY flew over, and they saw the American markings as the plane turned north toward Manila. At 5 p.m., a Dutch patrol bomber appeared and circled the convoy. From that time on, there was a constant succession of aircraft until they tied up at the pier in Balikpapan on December 15th. The war had begun for Seaman Bell. Henry A. Pizarski, the son of a Pittsburgh church builder, had just completed his solo flight as a civilian pilot training program cadet that day at Butler Airport, 30 miles north of Pittsburgh. It was the custom for the instructors and other student pilots to await the landing of the soloist, and when he climbed out of the cockpit of his airplane to drench him with a bucket of water. Pilot Pizarski landed and taxied up to the building. He stopped the engine and got out of the airplane, and nobody was there to give him the customary greeting. Puzzled and chagrined, Peasy went into the flight office. Half a dozen students and instructors were there, but no one looked up. Their attention was riveted on the radio. Peasy moved forward. "What's going on?" he asked. "Shh," said one of the others. "Listen, the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor." Silently, Peasy joined the group. Then he drove home, thinking about his pilot's license, which he ought to have in 6 months. His whole purpose in seeking a pilot's license was to further his chances of becoming a naval aviator, which he intended to do as soon as he had completed his sophomore year in college. It was a shock then, a few days later, when the civilian pilot training program officials announced the cancellation of all training licenses. But this was only temporary. A federal investigator came to screen Peasy and ascertain his reason for seeking a license. When he said he wanted to be a Navy pilot, his student certificate was reinstated, and he went on with the program. These stories, and stories like them, come from the war accounts of men who would later come together on one ship, the USS Gambier Bay, or, in naval parlance, Escort Carrier 73. Young men who had never seen a ship or the sea, others who had already spent years in the Navy, men who joined up to become pilots, and Naval Academy graduates who went where duty called. All these would join aboard the Escort Carrier to do their duty where God and the Navy took them. The Pearl Harbor attack had proved to the American Naval High Command a contention that the naval aviators had been making unsuccessfully for years. The aircraft carrier, and not the capital warship with heavy guns, was the major naval weapon of the future. Yet the lesson was not immediately learned because most of the senior naval aviators were not aviators at all, but battleship men who had gotten their wings so they could command carriers in days when the real aviators were too junior to hold such commands. Admiral King was one such man. He believed he knew a good deal more about the utilization of carriers than was actually the case, and since almost immediately King became Commander-in-Chief of the American naval forces, his ideas became effective orders. Carriers were employed singly, not in groups, each carrier to be the central ship in a large task force surrounded by cruisers and destroyers. Battleships were not included in the United States force, as they were in the Japanese, because the American battleships could not keep up with the cruisers and carriers. The employment of the carriers, too, was cautious, but there was reason for caution. America had only a handful of carriers, and once the Enterprise, Saratoga, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Wasp were committed to the Pacific, the Ranger was all that was left for Atlantic waters. In the very first weeks of war, the Naval High Command learned many lessons. Not least of these was that more carriers were desperately needed. The United States Navy had shamefully collected the lessons taught by the British for 2 years, and when war began, the senior American officer in charge of anti-submarine warfare was a chief petty officer. Neglect and a refusal to face facts left America's East Coast on December 8th with fewer than 100 naval craft capable of going to sea even to look for submarines. The same neglect had prevented the development of naval air. The auxiliary carrier program was, in the beginning, a ragtag and bob-tailed operation. The first such ship, the Long Island, was built by converting the merchant ship Mormac Mail, which took 77 days. This carrier had no island, which put it in the blind class with the Langley. The lesson was soon learned, however, and other small carriers were built to different plans. The panic button was pushed, and quickly a handful of jeep carriers were produced: USS Sangamon, USS Suwannee, USS Chenango, and USS Santee. They were built on the hulls of oilers, and they were still really oilers in performance. Sangamon had a flank speed of 18.5 knots theoretically, but that could be achieved only with the wind at the back of the carrier and going downhill, as one crew member put it. Hardly the manner in which carriers launched planes. Henry Kaiser, the operator of an enormous engineering combine, had contracted early in the defense effort to build ships for the American effort, and to replace the thousands of tons of shipping then being destroyed by German U-boats in the Atlantic. Shipyards at Vancouver, Washington, Swan Island, in the Willamette River at Portland, and in Richmond, California, were turning out Liberty ships, sometimes at the rate of 1 a day. Early in 1942, seeing the need for a better standard small carrier, Kaiser approached the Navy with plans for a baby flat top. The principal employment was to escort ships and thus solve the problem of the dreadful gap in the middle of the Atlantic where no air cover could reach from America or England, and where the merchant ships and their fragile and few destroyers and destroyer escorts and corvettes must run the gauntlet of German U-boat wolf packs. Kaiser wanted to build 30 such vessels. The Navy still had not quite gotten the idea about aircraft carriers and said no. Thereupon, Kaiser went to Admiral Emory S. Land, head of the United States Maritime Commission, and Land went to the White House. In some ways, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was his own best admiral, and he became enthusiastic about the proposal. For one thing, he knew very well from his exchanges with Prime Minister Winston Churchill that the U-boats operating off the United States coast in the first 6 months of 1942 had done more damage than the Japanese did at Pearl Harbor by far. And so, a contract was arranged. Kaiser would build 50 escort carriers on Maritime Commission P-1 hulls. The contract was signed in June 1942 and called for the first small carrier to be delivered in 6 months. But Kaiser didn't make it. After all, this was his first effort in building a naval warship, and it seemed remarkable that starting from scratch, naval architect George Sharp and the Kaiser Yard at Swan Island were able to move as rapidly as they did. It was 9 months, not 6, but by then the first of the new class of CVE-55 ships was completed. On April 5, 1943, Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt came to the yard and christened the first of the new series of ships, Casablanca. Captain Hugh Goodwin, down in Buenos Aires, had kept up his barrage of communications to Washington, and at the end of his year he was brought back as promised. He was offered the command of the USS Casablanca and went to the west coast to commission the ship, but there were delays, one after another, in her shakedown period. Finally, the Navy ordered Goodwin back to Washington. He was assigned to planning and later became Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air. Meanwhile, the small carriers were coming off the ways of the Kaiser shipyard, where what industrial writers often called a miracle of production was taking place. In this case, the hyperbole was certainly justified. In 1942, at Richmond, California, Kaiser built the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 7 days, 14 hours, and 29 minutes. To build the escort carriers and the cargo ships in the Northwest, Kaiser assembled thousands of workers, many of them recruited from Minneapolis and points east. In 110 days, the Kaiser organization built Vanport City in swampland between Portland and Vancouver, Washington, and created Oregon's second largest city. At the peak, it contained 10,400 housing units, hospitals, schools, and shops. The ships were built by entirely new methods, welded rather than riveted and prefabricated, cut up again if necessary into movable sections, and mounted in position by huge cranes. The yards worked 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, one shift's welders competing against the next on a hull to see who could lay down the most feet of welding in a day. That sort of competition kept an excitement bubbling in the yard and a care for the quality of the ship they were sending forth to go to sea. The ships kept coming off the ways. They were anything but elegant ships, these Casablanca-class carriers. By late 1942, when the CVE program was moving ahead, the number of shipyards in America had jumped from about a dozen to 300, all building various craft for the war effort. All of these vessels competed for certain materials. The Bogue-class carriers built in Tacoma were the first to get started, and were given a combination of diesel and steam machinery. The Commencement Bay class, also built at Tacoma, were promised standard-geared turbines. The Casablanca class were the Cinderellas, sometimes called the Woolworth carriers, and because they were last in line, to them was relegated the Skinner Uniflow reciprocating steam engine. In peacetime, no naval constructor in his right mind would have chosen the Skinner for any ship. The engines were cranky, hard to manage, and very expensive to operate. It was hard to maintain an adequate supply of clean boiler feed water. The condensate often contained lubricating oil carried with the expended steam. The engineers put loofah sponges in the hot wells and diatomaceous earth filters in the condensate lines, but not at first. All this had to be learned, and the Skinner could be an engineer's nightmare. But there it was. That was the allocation. It was all that was available, and whoever was going to be in charge had to make the best of it. The Casablanca had been built in 241 days. With each new hull, the shipbuilders worked against their own time, and when hull number 319 was laid down in the summer of 1943, they had learned a good deal about speeding up the processes. Number 319 was built in 171 days. Launched on November 22, 1943, and christened by Mrs. H.C. Zitzwitz, the wife of a commander on duty at the shipyard. Why the wife of a mere commander? For one reason. So many ships were being built in Kaiser yards that virtually every woman of prominence in the area had christened her ship. By the winter of 1943, the yards were hard-pressed to find sponsors. Jeep carriers were coming along so fast that the market was extremely small. Nevertheless, she was launched and christened, and the name chosen for hull number 319 was the USS Gambier Bay. It came from an obscure haven in Alaskan waters, named by Captain George Vancouver, the English explorer of the 18th century, for James Gambier, a British naval officer who enjoyed a distinguished career and finally became a peer and admiral of the fleet. The Gambier Bay was the 19th Casablanca-class carrier launched that year. The shipyard workers had promised President Roosevelt 18 carriers by the end of 1943, and the Gambier Bay was their bonus for the war effort. Once launched, Gambier Bay was sent down the river and into the Columbia. She was sailed to Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia for outfitting and commissioning. She was 512 feet long, with a flight deck 80 feet wide and 480 feet in length, a beam of 108 feet, and she displaced 7,800 tons. She carried one 5-inch gun on the fantail, 8 twin 40 mm, and 20 20 mm anti-aircraft guns in cup-like mountings above the hangar deck. Baby Flat Top was one name for her class. Her real weapons were the 30 aircraft that she would carry into battle. For these ships, there was very little consideration of battle in the usual naval sense. The Navy wanted them for escort duty, and their normal prey would be submarines, so the 5-inch gun seemed quite adequate. It could destroy the conning tower of a surface submarine and even hold a pressure hull. Like her sister ships, the Gambier Bay was designed with frugality and hurry in mind. The whole concept had been to take what was basically a merchant ship hull and make a carrier from it with minimum change for the shipbuilder. The main deck of the ship, had she been a merchantman, became the hangar deck. The flight deck was put atop, and a second deck was constructed below to accommodate the crew. Storerooms, magazines, and gasoline storage were also on the second deck. The accommodations were Spartan, steel bulkheads, bunks, and navy grey paint. Protection against bombs and gunfire came in the form of splinter shields for control and gun stations. The only practical means of protecting against torpedoes was a series of transverse bulkheads to subdivide the ship into compartments. There was nothing extra. There was a war to be won, and she was designed to play her part in it, and for that purpose only. By the time the Gambier Bay was launched, some of those who would sail in her were already wondering just how well she was designed for that role. On November 24th, during the American assault on the Gilbert Islands, the escort carrier Liscombe Bay was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and sank in 15 minutes, taking down Rear Admiral H.M. Mullenix, Captain I.D. Wilsey, 51 other officers, and 591 enlisted men. The Liscombe Bay was a Kaiser ship, hull number 3002, launched on April 19th that year, but not actually taken over by the Navy until August 7th. Her life then had actually been just over 3 months. The sinking of the Liscombe Bay was reported from the Gilberts by correspondent Robert Sherrod of Life magazine and other reporters. Louise Sherrod Bassett shivered a little at her brother's story, for by this time she and Ensign Bassett had married, and she knew he was going to be assigned to an escort carrier. In the ready cynicism of servicemen, the Kaiser carriers were dubbed Kaiser coffins, and many of those scheduled to serve in them came west with more than a little nervousness of spirit. Their minds were hardly eased by the joshing of the old salts. What did CVE mean? They would ask the boots, and when the youngsters stumbled, they would answer their own question. C is combustible, V is vulnerable, E is expendable, CVE is USS Gambier Bay. The little game never failed to give the youngsters a jolt, but the absolute truth of the statement was not to be known even to the old salts until one day in October. Then everyone aboard the Gambier Bay would remember the formula. Flying his desk in Washington made Captain Hugh Goodwin nervous. He was eager, determined to get a ship and get into action in the Pacific War. After the keel of hull number 319 was laid in July 1943, Goodwin watched the reports of ships building and commissioning on the west coast. By fall, he had settled on Escort Carrier 73 as the command he wanted, and every morning, after checking in at his desk, he would go upstairs to the detail office and have a cup of coffee with Captain Bob Hickey, an old friend. There, in the office, on a board, were listed all the escort carriers under construction with their status, and a space labelled Prospective Commanding Officer. Hickey chalked names into these spaces nearly every day, and the first time Goodwin saw Escort Carrier 73 on the board, there was a name chalked against it. He went to the board, picked up an eraser, wiped out the name, and chalked his own name in. The next morning, when he appeared, his name had been erased and the other substituted again. He repeated his performance of the day before, and so did the detail office. It became a sort of game. Every day Captain Goodwin would write, Captain Hugh H. Goodwin in the prospective commanding officer space of Escort Carrier 73. Every afternoon the detail office would substitute another name. This little exercise continued for 3 months. Finally, one day Goodwin came up to the detail office and found that his name was still on the board opposite Escort Carrier 73. He knew then that he had gotten his command. Goodwin was Navy through and through. He had enlisted in the First World War and served aboard the battleship USS Delaware when she was part of the 6th Battle Squadron attached to the British Grand Fleet in 1918. He won an appointment to the United States Naval Academy. He graduated with the class of 1922 and was commissioned. His first tour of duty was back in battleships, but in 1923 he transferred to the submarine service and in 1924 was assigned to Division 17 in the Philippines. He had 2 years of Far East service, wintering in the Philippines, then moving to China to escape the typhoon season. The Asiatic Fleet operated then out of Chu and Singa. In 1926 he was assigned to a destroyer, which was sent up the Yangtze River to show the flag. At the end of Goodwin's Far Eastern tour, he was assigned to submarine duty in the United States, and then elected to take flight training at Pensacola. From that time, although he wore the gold dolphins of the submarine service, he cast his lot with Naval Air. He was assigned to VF Squadron 1, Fighter Squadron 1, based on the carrier Saratoga, but before he could go to the Saratoga, he had to qualify for carrier landings. For this, he was assigned to the old carrier Langley, which made 14 knots. He was more than a little nervous, particularly after he saw the executive officer of his squadron make an approach before his own. Goodwin was off the Langley's port beam at 500 feet when his exec came in and caught a wire with one side of the fixed landing gear. The plane skidded across the flight deck to the port side and slid into the water. Goodwin was waved off as a destroyer came by and picked the executive officer out of the water. Then he was waved in by the landing signal officer. When he got the cut, the signal to turn his engine back to idle, he chopped the throttle. Involuntarily, he stretched his right leg, hit the rudder control, and threw the plane into a right skid that carried him over the nettings on the starboard side of the carrier. He righted the plane and caught a wire, but so far up the deck that he hit the barrier, wrapping the wire around the propeller of his plane. He was a qualified barrier pilot, and forever after he would know what it was like for a pilot to come in hot. They flew single-seat F-2B fighters in those days, and they were all hot pilots. Fighter Squadron 1, the Saratoga Squadron, was nicknamed the High Hat Squadron. The pilots painted high silk hats in circles on the sides of the fuselages of their planes. They wore red helmets, and the more flamboyant sported red flight jackets. Lieutenant Commander Pinky Knipe wore a red Van Dyke beard and a pair of Morowitz goggles, which gave him a distinctly rakish air. They were a pretty doggy outfit, they told themselves. The second commander of Fighter Squadron 1 was Lieutenant Commander Arthur Radford. Rad became a good friend to Lieutenant Goodwin, and when the senior officer went up to Washington to join the staff of Commander Air Battle Force, he persuaded the young hot pilot that there was more to naval aviation than waggling his wings. Goodwin was assigned to the Bureau of Aeronautics. Radford was instrumental in easing Goodwin's way into the Naval War College in 1933, which readied him for command, and then secured Goodwin's appointment. Radford was detail officer as aide to Captain A.B. Cook of the carrier Lexington. Where Radford left off, Cook took over. For most of the next 10 years, Goodwin's star was hitched securely to Cook's career aboard the Lexington. Goodwin became the first officer to hold the job of Air Operations Officer. Later, he was Cook's flag secretary when the Admiral took over as commander of the Air Scouting Force. Then came the Argentina assignment, with Radford and Ralph Davidson promising to get him out and get him a ship as soon as the task was done. Captain Goodwin was one of a new breed of naval aviators experienced in all types of ships and prepared for command. Whatever the hot pilot had been in his youth, by the time he went to the West Coast to pick up his ship and commission her, Captain Goodwin was as knowledgeable about carrier operations as any man in the Navy. He had commanded a training squadron at Pensacola and observation squadrons 1 and 2, and he knew what was needed to sail and fight an aircraft carrier. The first thing needed was a top ship, and that is precisely what Goodwin set out to produce when he left Washington with his orders. He was, from that moment, what in the old Navy they called a sundowner, a spit-and-polished disciplinarian. Arriving at Astoria, Captain Goodwin spent 2 weeks studying various new naval publications to be sure he was up to date on his command and battle procedures. Then he had a chance to see a Casablanca-class escort carrier in action. The Casablanca herself was on a training cruise in Puget Sound to break in the new crews assigned to various escort carriers. Goodwin went to Britain and rowed the ship to get the feel of her. Later, he was to bless the officer who had thought up the idea of the training program, for when his own crew of 1,000 officers and men began to assemble, he was to learn that he had some regular officers, some regular Navy enlisted men, and a few merchant Navy officers and men. But the vast majority of officers and men were signed up only for the duration of the war. They came from every state, including city slickers, farm boys, and everything in between. They were to embody a cliché of the war, the Wolf of America, and they knew virtually nothing about either the sea or a ship. If Captain Goodwin was to make a top ship of the Gambier Bay before she went into battle in a few months, he had his task laid out for him. Officers and men began appearing at Astoria. It was Captain Goodwin's duty to assemble them and integrate the crew into the ship, so that she became more than 7,800 tons of steel, copper, zinc, electric wiring, and the 1,000 inert components that make up a 20th-century ship of war. What Goodwin could do in the next few months would mean the difference between a ship and a fighting ship, and it might well mean the difference between death and survival for the 1,000 men who would man the Gambier Bay. They came from the far corners of America, men who were to man the new escort carrier Gambier Bay. Far and beyond, some were veterans of carrier warfare, and had been sunk in the Wasp and Hornet, lost early in the South Pacific. Some were veterans of China and the war in the Philippines, some of the Caribbean battle against the U-boats. But most of the young men who came to the base at Bremerton for training or reported to Astoria were fresh from the farms and towns of America, and their naval experience had not passed the training stage. To whip this raw green crew into shape, Captain Goodwin had a handful of regulars, Annapolis graduates, Mustangs who had come up to commissions through the ranks, and also merchant seamen who had been commissioned in the United States Naval Reserve. The executive officer was Richard R. Ballinger, who graduated from the Naval Academy in 1929. He had come up from Corpus Christi after a year and a half of shore duty. He knew what had happened at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, for he had been there as flag secretary to the Admiral commanding Patrol Wing 2. The air officer was Lieutenant Commander Fay Buzz Bors of the Naval Academy class of 1935, an All-American football player for Navy. The chief engineer was Lieutenant Commander J.A. Sanders, who had many years behind him in America's merchant marine. He had the thankless task of mastering the tricky boilers. Captain Goodwin wasted no time in beginning to shape the ship. Lieutenant G.D. Hazard had been assigned as navigation officer, but Goodwin took an instant dislike to him for no apparent reason, except that Hazard had been a reserve IGN in World War I. He was also a reserve officer, so Goodwin threw Hazard back into the officer pool and brought Lieutenant George Gorn up from first lieutenant to the job of navigator. He knew Gorn. The latter had been a Annapolis class of 25, but had resigned from the Navy after a few years and gone into the reserves. Goodwin's attitudes were not unusual. The Navy was full of cronyism in the years between the wars, as his own career indicated. A man got ahead by hitching his star to the wagon of a senior officer who was going someplace, and woe betide the man who fell afoul of a senior who could influence his career. One captain, for example, once ran his cruiser aground in heavy fog. The Board of Inquiry absolved him of blame, but unfortunately Admiral King was aboard the ship that day. Indeed, he was the cause of the accident because he had insisted that the captain speed the ship in heavy weather so that King could make an appointment ashore. King never forgot or forgave, and that captain never had another command, although he was one of the most competent men in the Navy. That was the Navy way. Many youngsters who came aboard the Gambier Bay did not understand or appreciate the Navy way, and so from the first Captain Goodwin was not a popular skipper with either the officers or the men. Popularity was not his major concern. He was a disciplinarian and forgave no error. Good intentions excuse only children and fools when the chips are down and battle is joined. It is the results that count, said Captain Goodwin. He intended to be certain that the results aboard the Gambier Bay were positive. The officers and men came along, and, as necessary, Goodwin judged them and discovered what use he could make of them and what allowances must be made for their deficiencies. When he asked Lieutenant Gorn to become navigator, Gorn demurred, saying he had not done any navigating since his student days. Goodwin insisted, "Well, okay, I will take the job if you will be patient with me." "Patience isn't one of my long suits, but I'll do the best I can," said the captain. He was as good as his word. Later he recalled that he could never trust Gorn's navigation, at least he did not, but he was satisfied that he had the man he wanted in the job he wanted him in. From the first, Goodwin liked Lieutenant Commander Sanders, the engineering officer. A few swift questions assured him that Sanders knew his engines, and that was all that was required. He also liked the appearance of Lieutenant Richard Elliott, the ship's intelligence officer. Elliott was a reserve officer older than most of them and a life insurance agent by profession. Goodwin had known Lieutenant Mr. Broad, the communications officer, in a previous assignment. This made Broad go down well with him. A few enlisted men had been in previous Goodwin organizations, but for the most part they were quantities unknown to the captain and required some sorting out. This, in turn, took time. One young watch officer, for example, never pleased Goodwin from the first day. The captain decided Lieutenant Coleman would not do, and proceeded accordingly. Coleman often felt the rasp of Goodwin's tongue, or was ordered to his quarters for some infraction, real or fancied, of the captain's orders. As the new men arrived, the future was laid out for them in the captain's first message, written down in the commissioning issue of the ship's newspaper. Goodwin believed in telling it like it is. "Obviously, I firmly believe in the old Navy adage that a taut ship is a happy ship. I shall require smartness and efficiency of the officers and men of the Gambier Bay. I shall demand the accomplishment of difficult tasks as a matter of routine and the accomplishment of impossible tasks on frequent occasions. Now the builders are finished and our job begins. We must complete the work begun by the shipbuilders and make ourselves the fighting crew which will complete the Gambier Bay, always bearing in mind that our ultimate mission is to engage the enemy. We now face the task of preparing ourselves for that hour." The statement might not have been totally logical, but it was in the naval tradition, intended to inspire the young men coming aboard and, at the same time, warn them that there would be no mollycoddling. That commissioning issue of the ship's newspaper had been prepared by a handful of officers and men who comprised the skeleton crew of the Gambier Bay, the pre-commissioning detail. A few days before the ship came downriver from the Willamette, the officers and men began straggling in. The Navy had secured office space, or what passed for that, in the confines of a wartime warehouse. Some of the furniture was left over from World War I days when Astoria had been a commissioning port for the old wooden transports still lined up in mothballs a few miles away. Most of the furniture was improvised from 2x4 and boards, and most of the chairs were wooden crates. Astoria in winter is cold and bleak, with winds lashing in across the bar from the Pacific, or whistling down the Columbia River carrying rain or sleet that could chill a man to the marrow. It was primarily a fishing town, populated by Scandinavian Americans. Originally a poor town at best, the expanded population had pressed hard on the town's limited housing space and a handful of restaurants. The crew began to arrive, and some of them brought their wives for those last few weeks of family life before the men set out to war. The wives settled into drab hotel rooms, and their husbands disappeared early in the morning and did not return until dark. Christmas was the worst time. Lieutenant Ranny Odom had arrived to join the detail on December 22nd, bringing his wife along. On Christmas Eve, they found the confines of their hotel rooms stifling and went out for a walk in the evening gloom. They passed neat rows of wooden houses, each with its little garden or yard, and saw the lights of the big Douglas Christmas trees inside and heard the laughter in the bright rooms. For Ranny Odom, it was a low point of his life. A few days after the arrival of the commissioning detail, the Gambier Bay was sailed down from the shipyard by a civilian crew, accompanied by a handful of officers. Then the work of final outfitting began. Captain Goodwin gave a dance party for the officers, and one Sunday afternoon he opened the ship to visitors. Thus the wives had small glimpses of the people and the surroundings in which their husbands would live. Gingerly, the officers and men got to know one another. As the circle broadened, Lieutenant Commander Neil Curtin, the supply officer, had sailed down the river in the Gambier Bay and had already begun to lay in stores. The others began to come aboard, and as their wives left for home to take stateroom assignments aboard the ship, the Gambier Bay began to buzz with activity. The doctors, dentists, chaplain, and others came aboard. The chaplain was Lieutenant Verrer Carlson, a Lutheran. He had been transferred up from the Naval Air Station at Monterey, California, to join the Carrier. He came with some misgivings, for his wife Mildred was 3 months pregnant with their first child. But this was the duty he had requested, and there was no turning back. Upon arrival, he discovered that in the chaplain's division, and in others, the escort carriers had been short-changed. There was no altar and no organ aboard, and he had to find his own within the narrow resources of Western Oregon. It took some doing, but it was done. The chaplain also discovered that many of the men of the Gambier Bay could play various instruments, and some had brought them along. He sorted out a ship's band, entirely unofficial, and began scouting Astoria's music and second-hand stores for more instruments and sheet music. Before they left Astoria, they had what the captain called the only ship's band in the escort carrier fleet. Perhaps the busiest man on the ship was Lieutenant Commander Kingston Houlihan, who was responsible for all ship's construction. There were changes to be made and additions, and Houlihan hurried from the hangar deck to the flight deck and up to the island 12 times a day. In January, the men kept coming, many of them from schools and training stations. Tony Peniak was one of these. He had enlisted in the Navy in February 1943 with his father's reluctant consent and was sent to boot camp at Seneca Lake, New York, for basic training. After leave, he went to the Navy Technical Training Center at Norman, Oklahoma, where he graduated after 26 weeks as Seaman First Class Aviation Machinist Mate Striker. He was sent to Chicago to join the old training carrier SS Wolverine, a converted sidewheel steamer that had run on the Great Lakes for years. Then he went to Sandpoint Naval Air Station at Seattle, where 4 more weeks made an oxygen specialist of him. Next point for Peniak was the Naval Air Station at Astoria. On December 28, 1943, he joined the Gambier Bay. Seaman Bell's ship, the USS Trinity, made a number of trips to the Middle East to load oil and aviation gasoline for the Allied forces, first in the Dutch East Indies and then lost in Australia in November 1943. Bell was ordered back to the United States for leave. After his leave, he was sent to Bremerton, Washington, to await reassignment. He went by train, dreaming of Paducah, Kentucky, all the way. At Bremerton, he was assigned to Escort Carrier 73, and in a few days sent to Tacoma and then down with a detail of other new men to join the ship. As a member of the original crew and a plank owner, the responsibility bore heavily on him. He decided on January 1st, 1944, to dedicate his diary to the story of his ship. Considering us commissioned and in Astoria, Oregon, this day of January 1st, 1944, may we see many battles and kill many enemies, and then return to our mothers and other loved ones. God help us win. If those sentiments seem bloodthirsty, they were the common feelings of the day among these young men who were committed to battle against the Japanese enemy. Captain Goodwin certainly shared those feelings. The scuttlebutt had it that his brother had been a victim of the death march staged by the Japanese to move the captured Americans and Filipinos of Corregidor to Manila prison. It was not true. Captain Goodwin never had a brother. The tale was made up in the mess hall to account for the captain's ferocious attitude toward the enemy. Some men, of course, had personal scores to settle. Seaman Bell had some feelings about the war after nearly 2 years in combat, during which the Japanese always seemed to be ahead. The ship's company also included several very young warriors. One day Captain Goodwin was on the bridge when he heard one of his orderlies, Seaman Sankey, over in the comm talking about the 17 Club. He called Sankey over and asked, "What the hell is this 17 Club? I don't know whether you know it or not, but we've got a lot of fellows here on this ship who are just 17 years old. We aren't like those old bastards, 18 years old, who enlisted in the Navy just to keep from getting drafted into the Army. We didn't have to enlist. We did it because we wanted to do something for our country, and we thought the Navy was the place to do it. So we got up this 17 Club. 17, they seemed like children. But what the captain didn't know was that about half the members of the 17 Club weren't even 17, but bloodthirsty 15, and 16-year-olds out to win the war. Radioman 3rd Class Liac Column was one of those who came down with the draft from Britain to join the ship on the day of commissioning, and his sentiments were shared by most of the young men who were seeing their first warship. The first warship they could call their own. Never had a ship looked so beautiful to us. We stood in amazed amazement gazing at her as she lay at anchor in the mouth of the Columbia River. This was our ship. Blood-tingling excitement, strange adventures, 1,000 lives packed into a single lifetime. All this filled our imaginations. This was the goal of grinding work, strenuous training, and endless hours of study. Proud, strutting peacocks were drab by comparison. The ship was ready, and the captain was ready. The crew was assembling and making ready for the task ahead. In the spring of 1942, Henry Pisarski, aged 20, was a strange combination of knowledge and ignorance. He was knowledgeable about European politics far beyond his years, but at the same time his ignorance of the world about him made Pisky seem naive and younger than his years. Both conditions were a result of family background. His mother and father had immigrated to the United States in 1913 from their native Poland. He had grown up in a religious patriarchy and had scarcely spent a night away from home until he joined the Navy. Polish was spoken as much as English in the household. His father followed Polish and German politics and explained his speeches to the family. By 1939, Henry Pisky and his 2 brothers all took it for granted that they would soon go to war to fight Hitler. But that assumption changed for Henry Pisky when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. He completed his year at Carnegie Institute of Technology on June 4, 1942, and a few days later left Pittsburgh for Philadelphia and induction into the Navy. He was assigned to the Navy 5-5 class that would begin June 11th at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. On the night before Henry Pisky left home, the family had a quiet dinner. The next day, Anthony Piskey took his third son to Pittsburgh's Pennsylvania station. At the station, father embraced son in the European fashion with a kiss on each cheek and a bear hug. He told him an embarrassed little joke to indicate that Henry was now a man of the world. "Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker," quoting Dorothy Parker. Then Henry was gone on the great adventure of his life. At Philadelphia's induction center, Piskey was pushed, pummeled, examined, and passed as fit for pilot training. He was taken out to a cafeteria with other young men, brought back, and told he was an apprentice seaman in the United States Navy and would be paid the princely sum of $11, $12.5 per month. Then his group of 40 men was herded aboard another train, heading south to ride all night to Durham, North Carolina, and then put aboard buses that took them to Chapel Hill and the university campus where their training would begin. More tests came next. Depth perception particularly troubled Piskey, and the physical program began to toughen these young men and prepare them for war in the air. They learned to shoot a rifle and read Morse code, and they learned aircraft identification. So much time was spent on Japanese aircraft that they assumed they were headed for the Pacific Theater. They did push-ups and sit-ups, rolled on their bellies, marched, boxed, swam, ran obstacle courses. Finally, they graduated to become cadets. They were outfitted in new uniforms and told they would receive $1.75 a month. Then they were given leave for 2 weeks to go home, show off their new navy blues, and impress their families and friends. Cadet Piskey came close to washing out in primary training at Lambert Field, St. Louis. His flight instructor did not seem to pay much attention to him, and when he was tested in aerobatics, he received 2 down checks, which meant automatic appearance before the washout board. He pleaded for complete instruction and was given another chance. This time he was flying an old Stearman biplane with a check pilot in the second seat, when suddenly the propeller flew off and the engine began to race uncontrollably. It would tear itself loose from its mountings and might pull the airplane apart in the process. The correct procedure was to cut the ignition and make a dead-stick landing, but young pilots at this stage seldom faced the problem Piskey had been posed. Just that question had been asked in the psychological examination given him before his board appearance. He remembered to cut the power and landed in a farm field. As the plane stopped, the instructor came forward and said, "Young man, you have just earned your Navy wings." There was no leave before transfer to Pensacola for further training. The pilots learned takeoff and landing techniques, aerobatics, formation flying, navigation, and other tricks of the Navy pilot's trade. After Pensacola, Piskey chose torpedo tactics as his preference and was sent to Barron Field on the Alabama coast of the Gulf of Mexico. After a few months at Barron, Piskey was designated as a naval aviator and assigned to torpedo training. He was not quite 21 years old when he was sent to Fort Lauderdale to train in the new Grumman TBF torpedo bombers. His instructors included officers who had flown from the decks of Wasp and Hornet before they were sunk, sent home to train the boys who would replace them on new carriers. On good days they flew, and on bad days they practiced instrument flying in the Link trainer. At Fort Lauderdale, Piskey met Jess Holman, a pilot from Wiggins, Mississippi. Jess was the most popular man in the group. His career and Piskey's would be intertwined from that point on, although they did not then know it. Pilot Piskey was careful. He practiced in his chosen aircraft, the torpedo bomber. Fighters, especially flying to the edge of a stall, he was a disciplined pilot, as befitted a man who would be carrying a torpedo or its equivalent, and would be responsible for the safety of a gunner and a radio man. He learned to observe and follow the signals of the landing signal officer without question. At the very end of training came an object lesson in flight technique. Enan Blair, the tail-end Charlie in formation, overshot, cut the throttle back all the way, forgetting the characteristic heaviness of the aircraft, and mushed into a cypress swamp where the plane burst into a ball of red flame. Blair's crewmen survived, but pilot Blair lived just another 36 hours. That sobering experience just behind him, Piskey headed for Glenview, Illinois, where he would make a carrier checkout on the SS Wolverine on Lake Michigan. He and Ensign Eli and Enan Jess Holman were together, all assigned to go on from there to San Diego for assignment to a carrier that was going into the Pacific. They had heard that the carrier air group destined for the USS Enterprise was training at Sandpoint, and the thought came to them that they might be replacement pilots for the Enterprise. Excited by the prospect, Piskey and Holman took the train to Sandpoint Naval Air Station at Seattle. Their orders said Composite Squadron 10, but they thought it was a misprint and meant Torpedo Squadron 10, the torpedo squadron of the Enterprise. They arrived in Seattle on September 10, 1943. Quite another sort of pilot was Leo Zola, a Southern California boy who joined the V-5 program in August 1942. Zola trained at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles at Del Monte, and then went to Livermore for flight training in Stearman biplanes, which gave him the exciting feeling of flying by the seat of your pants. Very early in the program, Cadet Zola, Cadet Bob Zell, and another pilot named Hill went out for solos in the Stearmans. Somehow, Zell and Hill collided in mid-air, and both were killed. When Leo Zola came down safely, he was met by a group of officials. All they wanted was his name. That was the only way they could determine who had been killed. There was something very impersonal about the experience that shook Zola severely. Cadet Zola was a lively fellow. A few months earlier, after a pilot had buzzed the Livermore rodeo grounds during a show, the commanding officer of the field indicated that buzzing civilians was virtually a capital offence. So Leo Zola knew there was no doubt about that. He knew. One night, Zola met a pretty girl in town. The next day his steerman came over Livermore, dropped down to treetop level, and roared down her street. She came out waving a tablecloth, and he dipped his wings as he went by. Just then, dead ahead, he saw a flagpole. He managed to miss a collision, then he was out of town and flying ever so carefully back to the Livermore field. He landed sedately and taxied down to the far end of the parking ramp, cut off the power, got out, and began walking toward the control tower. As he walked, he caught the glint of sun on field glasses, and as he walked further, he saw a knot of people in the tower. Finally, he realized the glasses were trained on him. Perhaps he was beginning to believe he had a problem. The nature of the problem became clear when Zola reached the tower, and a furious flight operations officer came rushing down. "You are Cadet Zola?" "Yes, sir." "You were flying Stearman number 3 BX-47? "Yes, sir." "Cadet Zola, you are grounded until further notice." Cadet Zola continued to go to his ground school classes, but he found his pals avoided him as if he had the measles. Half the people on the field expected Zola would be washed out at any moment, but he was lucky. A new commander was assigned to the field, and the flight operations officer did not want to present the picture of a station full of troublemakers. He called Zola in one day. "Cadet Zola, if you will forget what happened, so will I." Zola was only too glad to cooperate, but he wondered just how he had been caught in the first place. Months later, he encountered a senior pilot at another station. The other officer recognized him and told him the TT. The other officer had been stationed at Livermore as an instructor. On a day off, he was sitting in the living room of his rented house in town when suddenly, just outside the picture window, a Stearman trainer floated by at eye level, so close that he could not fail to make out the identifying numbers on the fuselage. Furious at the idiot pilot who was endangering, firstly, the peace, secondly, government property, thirdly, his own life, and fourthly, the entire community, the officer reported to the control tower at Livermore Airfield. Having survived that prank, Zola went on to Corpus Christi Naval Air Station. There he was nearly washed out by an embittered aviator who had been flying combat with the Royal Air Force in Europe, had rejoined the United States Navy after the Japanese attack, only to be made an instructor instead of a carrier pilot. But Zola was lucky again. He survived the embittered officer's bad report and was sent on to continue training as a fighter pilot. Zola was still on the east coast of the United States when Enan Pizarski and Enan Holman headed for Seattle. At that point, Cadet Zola didn't know of their existence or of the building of an escort carrier called the USS Gambier Bay. Composite Squadron 10, the composite squadron of fighter and torpedo pilots who would man the plains of Gambier Bay, was born at Sandpoint Naval Air Station in Washington on September 23, 1943. With a handful of pilots present, the senior officer was Lieutenant John Stewart, a veteran who was 23 years old and had been a pilot and instructor at Pensacola for a little more than 2 years. However, by far the most famous person in the squadron had achieved his renown in efforts totally unconnected with the Navy scene. He was Lieutenant Vine Bell, who had left a successful career as a magazine writer and novelist to join the Navy. In all, there were 14 officers, 3 chiefs, and 38 enlisted men in the fledgling squadron: Pisarski, Holman, Enan, Hovey, Seymour, another famous man who had played fullback for Yale in 1939, Ensign Don Kramer, and Enan Nick Carter, whose specialties were torpedo launching and cigars. Lieutenant Commander Edward J. Huxtable, the commanding officer, and Lieutenant Henry Bassett, the executive officer, arrived a few days later. Since both Huxtable and Bassett were torpedo plane pilots, Stewart became the flight officer and leader of the fighter component at Sandpoint. During those first few days, the pilots flew war-weary aircraft returned from combat zones. The fuselages of most of the fighter planes bore flags of the rising sun, indicating aerial victories over the Japanese enemy. However, the engines of these planes were tired, the wings creaked, and on the ground the aircraft were perhaps more dangerous than they were in the air. The brakes seldom worked properly, a particular problem at Sandpoint, where the airfield consisted of one runway with water at either end. Lieutenant Commander Huxtable arrived at Sandpoint on September 28, 1943. A week later, the squadron moved to the Clatsop County Airport outside Astoria. The change was, if anything, for the worse as far as the pilots were concerned. At Astoria, it seemed to rain all the time, and Lieutenant Stewart recalled the field as having 2 runways with mudflats between them. Those old, tired fighters and torpedo bombers squeaked and slid through the mud and rain day after day. It was simply coincidence that Composite Squadron 10 would begin organization and training at Astoria. The squadron arrived 2.5 months before Gambier Bay came down to the mouth of the Columbia River, and by the time the ship arrived, most of the squadron was gone. But no one would forget Astoria because of the rain and the cold. Skipper Huxtable had a special reason to remember the place. One day, Huxtable decided it was high time to check out in a fighter. Since he was commander of the squadron, he got into the F-4F, cleared the ground in fine style, flew easily around the area, and when he came into land, he followed standard operating procedure, which was to wind the wheels down. However, standard operating procedure for the fighter called for 33 turns on the handle to lock the wheels, and he turned only 32. As Huxtable's plane settled onto the runway, the wheels struck, skidded, and then retracted. The Wildcat slid along the runway, gasoline began spilling out of the tanks, ignited, and flames began to chase the plane. The Wildcat came to a screeching halt with the firemen spraying furiously. Skipper Huxtable got out and walked away disdainfully, muttering, "It takes a damned athlete to fly one of those." That was the last time anyone in the squadron could recall Huxtable flying a fighter. If the pilots needed experience, they got it. One day, Lieutenant Stewart took off in his fighter to tow the gunnery sleeve on 1,600 feet of steel cable. He put the Wildcat into a steep climb to go over the mountain that stands behind Astoria. Just as he nosed up, the throttle arm broke off, the revolutions per minute gauge dropped 50%, and the FM2 began to nose over. Stewart released the target banner and 1,600 feet of cable over downtown Astoria, and then nursed the crippled plane back to the airfield. As he landed, he remembered he could not shut off the throttle and came in hot. The brakes, as usual, failed, and the Wildcat ended up with its nose in the mudflat. The chiefs and the mechanics swore none of the fighters was even fit for flying. Ensign Charles Dugan dropped one Wildcat in the bay short of the runway one day, but the most exciting adventure at Astoria was that of Ensign James Lisher. One Sunday, Lisher had 3 flights. The first 2 were uneventful, shooting at a sleeve target pulled by another fighter, and Lisher made several runs on the target. On his third hop, as he pulled out of a pass, the engine coughed and then began to run rough. Lisher had enough experience in the Wildcat to know its gliding characteristics were similar to that of a stone. He took a quick fix. He was at 4,300 feet and might make it back to the field. But as he turned toward shore, the engine began to miss and lose power and then altitude. His hope of reaching the airfield vanished, but he might make the beach. As the engine sound worsened, he began to wonder. He glanced at the altimeter. He still had 3,800 feet of altitude, but smoke was coming from the engine, then flames, and the engine quit entirely. Ensign Lisher pulled the hood release, the canopy popped open, and he looked at the altimeter again. 3,500 feet. He undid his safety belt, climbed out of the cockpit, and at 3,000 feet he jumped headfirst. After waiting a second to be sure he was clear, he pulled the ripcord of his parachute. Nothing happened for an agonizing second. Then the parachute popped open and yanked him into a sitting position. Feeling like a prince of the air, he rode it down, drifting until he was about 10 feet off the surface. Then he slipped out of the harness and dropped into the ocean. The parachute floated away. The Pacific was cold. He pulled the carbon dioxide cords on the Mae West life vest and bobbed like a cork. A torpedo bomber fighter flew low over him and dropped a life raft. He clambered in and shivered in the bottom in the wind. An hour went by. Then Lisher saw a PBY flying boat. It circled, splashed down, and taxied up to him. He got aboard, and in a few minutes was back at his base. In the dispensary, the squadron flight surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Wayne Stewart, gave him a shot of brandy, 5 cups of coffee, and had him bedded down with hot water bottles for the night. The next day, Ensign Lisher was as good as new and back to duty. Gradually, the squadron began to take shape. When Chief Petty Officer Morris Montgomery reported at Clatsop Airfield in Astoria shortly after the squadron was organized, Commander Huxtable greeted him like a long-lost brother. Montgomery was one of a tiny handful of regulars who had joined the Navy before the war. Nearly all the enlisted men were fresh from the civilian streets and farms, and what they knew about naval aircraft could usually be carried in a coin purse. A handful of recruits had been sent from basic training to the service schools and given cram courses in specialties, engines, hydraulics, guns, but most had basic training, a short aircraft indoctrination course, and then assignment to the squadron. There was only one way for them to learn: on the job. Chief Montgomery was the chief aviation machinist, and Chief Walter Flanders, who had made Chief Petty Officer since Pearl Harbor Day, was Chief Metal Smith. Those two, and one other Chief Petty Officer, A. Andrews, were entrusted with the responsibility of servicing aircraft for training of pilots and air crews, while training the young recruits to do their jobs. No wonder Commander Huxtable was ready to embrace Chief Montgomery that first day. In the next few months, a handful of experienced men would be responsible for training 300 men of the air squadron. Once they boarded their carrier, 260 of those men would be transferred to the ship's complement, and only 40 enlisted men would remain attached to the squadron, the air crewmen and a handful of skilled maintenance people, including Chief Montgomery. Chief Montgomery took one look around, and his spirits fell. Those tired old clunkers from the battle zone would demand constant expert attention if they were to keep flying. He went to work, fighting to catch up and keep all aircraft operational, but he never made it. But by the time the new fighters and torpedo bombers were ready, at least all concerned had an idea as to what they were doing. Montgomery, Flanders, and Andrews were thrown together in their efforts to make a fighting team out of a gang of boots. In December 1943, the new planes were ready for the squadron, and Composite Squadron 10 was ordered to move south to Holtville, California, where the weather was more conducive to training operations. By train and plane, the men began to move out in the 3rd week of December. Commander Huxtable was one of the last to leave, and before he went south, the Gambier Bay appeared at the mouth of the Columbia. Huxtable went aboard to call on his new skipper, Captain Goodwin, and to look over the ship. He was only aboard a short while, had a chat with Goodwin, and renewed acquaintance with Commander Buzz Boris, whom he had known at the Naval Academy. Then it was off to Holtville and training in carrier tactics. Neither Commander Huxtable nor the squadron would see the Gambier Bay again until April. In a way, Seaman First Class Tony PNC found it a great relief to be ordered aboard the Gambier Bay. He knew he was slated for service aboard one of the new Escort carriers, but it had seemed a long time coming. On December 27, 1943, when he came aboard, he had his first look at an Escort carrier and got into his first flap. Seaman First Class PNC was extremely conscious of the importance of his specialty in oxygen. He reported to V2 Division, where he was shown the oxygen transfer shop. Within an hour, he learned that he was supposed to be responsible to a second-class aviation machinist who knew nothing about oxygen. Indignantly, Seaman First Class PNC sought out his divisional officer and demanded a transfer. Obviously, such problems as Seaman First Class PNCs were going to take some sorting out. The Gambier Bay was commissioned the next day. For the 3 weeks following the commissioning of their ship, the officers and men of the Gambier Bay were busy sorting out their affairs while the ship loaded stores and the first lieutenant built new equipment not planned by Kaiser. The Gambier Bay was organized into departments and divisions like any ship. The difference between the carrier and a destroyer, for example, was that aboard the Gambier Bay, the most important and largest department was the Air Department. Perhaps Captain Goodwin did not see it quite that way. The pilots never believed he was very sympathetic to their cause, and he certainly exerted equal effort and devoted equal attention to every department of his ship. But the pilots and all those concerned with the Air Department operated on the principle that the Gambier Bay was a floating platform whose reason for being was to launch the aircraft to attack the enemy. The Air Department was organized into 4 divisions. V1, concerned with the flight deck, but since neither the composite air group nor the landing signal officer were aboard yet, V1's activity was limited. V2, concerned with activities on the hangar deck, although their area of responsibility included much more. V3, the administrative arm of the Air Department, responsible for radar, aerology, photography, and air intelligence. V4, the Aircraft Ordnance Division, concerned with the guns, bombs, and torpedoes of the aircraft. In charge of all these activities was Lieutenant Commander Buzz Boris, the Annapolis football hero, who almost immediately became the most popular officer aboard the ship. The activity aboard the Gambier Bay during these 3 weeks was endless. In the photo laboratory, for example, the men turned the place upside down. Chief photographer's mate Weldon Sparrow was in charge of the lab, and with his 4 photographers, he set out to make their installation shipshape. This meant installing 2 bunks for men on duty and setting up the permanent positions of the dryers, aerial film equipment, and developing tanks. This had to be done before they went to sea. It was the same in every department, and all this activity came under the eyes of 6 professionals, Naval Academy graduates. They were the captain, the executive officer, the navigator, the air officer Boris, his assistant Lieutenant Elmo Waring, and later the squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Huxtable. All the rest were amateurs with the exception of a handful of enlisted professionals. In 2 or 3 months, the professionals would have to whip the ship into the shape of a fighting machine. On the day before the Gambier Bay was ready to sail from Astoria, Lieutenant Odom, the aerology officer, began saying his goodbyes to his wife Flora D. They had considered the idea of having Flora D come down to San Diego for a few more weeks, as the Gambier Bay was destined to be there soon. But she was pregnant and expecting in March, so they decided it was best that she head homeward to Savannah. Odom boarded the Gambier Bay. His new home would be stateroom 206, which he shared with 3 other junior-grade lieutenants. It was a solid grey environment, grey bulkheads, grey bunks, grey blankets, grey desk chair, and metal closet. On his side of the stateroom, the other side was an exact copy. Odom and Lieutenant Sidney Kimball, the assistant communications officer, were the plank owners, and for a few weeks they would have the compartment to themselves. Each staked out a lower in the 2 double bunks and settled in. Stateroom 206 was the last compartment forward on the 2nd level of the ship, below the flight deck. It was an admirable location in every way save one, several decks down with the aviation gas stowage compartments, surrounded by cofferdams filled with inert gas to minimize the effects of any explosion. Nonetheless, Odom had a vague feeling as he lay in his bunk at night that he was lying atop a giant firecracker. From his stateroom, Lieutenant Odom wandered back to the wardroom amidships, just below the hangar deck. The captain, of course, would not appear here often. He had his own private quarters on the starboard side, just below the flight deck and adjacent to the island, which was the command tower bridge of the carrier. The eyes, the ears, and the centre of operations at the island's lowest level was the captain's sea cabin, a tiny stateroom. Around the bridge, the landing signal officer, the catapult officer, and the arresting gear officer all had their stations below the island. On the first deck was the operations office, air plot, and next to it was the radar control room, or combat information centre. Across the ship on the port side, connected by a passageway, was the aerology office. Looking over that office, Lieutenant Odom decided a bunk would have to go here too for aerographer's mate First Class John Ammon. The inner office of aerology was the map room, where Odom would work at a chest-high plotting table. He would also stand watches as junior officer of the deck, which, with his flat feet, would be torture. He could, of course, plead physical hardship and be taken off the watch list, but after only a few weeks' acquaintance with Captain Goodwin, Lieutenant Odom was sure that if he did so, he would also be relieved as a ship's officer, sent to the pool, and probably end up either counting laundry at a shore station or running up balloons on some half-deserted island. He decided to suffer in silence. As far as the bridge was concerned, by January perhaps half the ship's complement was aboard.